Perfect.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Are you guys all ready? I'm going to share my screen in a minute. Before I do that, I just want to introduce myself a little bit more. I am Mark Adams. I'm the Education Director at the Harry S. Truman Library Museum, which is in Independence, Missouri. As you can see, I'm in my kitchen today because our museum is currently closed due to both the pandemic, but also we're doing a massive museum renovation, $25 to $30 million renovation. And so today, I thought I'd give you the opportunity to kind of see a sneak peek of some of the exhibits that are going in. Just some logistics. We're hoping to reopen this spring, both once the pandemic is calmed down and also once the renovation is finally complete. They're at the point now of doing final touches and should be done with the installation of the exhibits and artifacts probably in March, and hopefully we can reopen, depending on the pandemic, maybe by Truman's birthday in May. I will do questions at the end because once I start sharing my screen, I can't see those, but if you've got questions, I think we can put them in the Q&A, and I'll take those at the end. I'm going to share my screen and show you some photographs as we go along. So let me just switch to that real quick, and should be able to see the slide that says, thank you, Terry, An Ordinary Man and His Extraordinary Journey. And that's actually the name of the new permanent exhibit that's being installed at the moment, very close to completion. And I'm going to show you, I was actually fortunate enough to be in the building last week. So some of the photographs are from that. And I've actually got some that show from the exhibits in September and then how they've changed a little bit by the end of January as this process has gone on. So the idea of this exhibit, though, before I start to kind of go into the details, is to tell the entire story of Truman's life and his presidency all on one level, which we've not been able to do before. But previously, we've had exhibits about Truman's early life downstairs in our museum, and then upstairs has been devoted to the Truman presidency. But this is now going to be all on one level. And the reason I say that is that to do that, we've actually reconfigured the entrance to the building and built out a new entrance on the east side of the building. So we're going to start out in the parking lot looking at a new entrance that people will come into. And this is a slightly older photograph. As you can see, we've got the boards on the doors and things, but they do have a new presidential seal on that glass there on the main entrance as you come in. And then the old entrance with that beautiful entrance with the columns and so on, it will be still used for special events and things like that. But for regular day-to-day museum visitation, that entrance will be closed off. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through these many photographs I have to share with you this afternoon. So as we step inside the building and look back out the direction we came, you can see that presidential seal in the glass. And I'm not going to show you too many photographs of the lobby. We're going to get right into the exhibits here in a minute. But this will kind of give you an orientation, especially those that are familiar with the building. This is our old east side, where people would come in for special events and things like that. This is now going to be the new museum entrance. And not only did the entrance move over to the east side, but our gift shop is moving over to the east side too. So this is going to be the exterior of the gift shop. And then you can see inside where they're putting the fixtures in place. And you can see this is pretty close except for all the merchandise, the books and the t-shirts and so on. But all the shelving units and everything are going in place for this new gift shop and admissions desk. They'll be right at the entrance on this east side of the building. So then as we go into the galleries themselves, some of the spaces look rather incomplete. They're getting closer. But as you go in, as I said, we're going to be telling the entire story of Truman's life, really from birth to death. And in fact, even before his birth, this wall will eventually show the Truman family tree back to his grandparents and also Bess Wallace Truman, as she was mentioned as we were gathering, and Bess Wallace's family too, back to grandparents showing a family tree on this wall. And as you can see, they're still in the process of building that part of their exhibit. And then next to it is going to be this wall that's going to be called Lasting Impressions, which is really lasting impressions on Harry Truman as he grew up. And I've got a better exhibit photograph of that here in a second. Here's how the two pieces intertwine, the family tree on the right and the lasting impressions on the left. And then this is from last week, where they started to fill in all of those spaces on that wall with a variety of interactives that look at different things that influenced Truman growing up. So whether that was his school teachers, his life on the farm, his own family background, his reading, his glasses, his earliest memories, all of these things that had lasting impressions on his life, how they shaped his character, how they shaped his personality, and ultimately how they led him to the presidency. So this whole wall next to that family tree will be a whole series of interactive displays that will explain more about all of those early influences on Truman's life through his family, education, and so on, and how his character developed as a result. In the same room on the opposite wall, and this is kind of prior to exhibits going in, there's going to be looking at Truman's early life on the farm and growing up in Independence. And there's some of those exhibits going in place. So I'll be looking at his early childhood, his schooling in Independence, his parents, his love of books, and all of those types of things. And you can probably see a better view here as I step back into the room. You can see the boyhood on the left. There's an empty case there. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then some of the early jobs that he had over on the right side. So both working in banks in Kansas City to working on the family farm. And ultimately, we'll get to World War I just on the next exhibit. In the empty case there will be installed a piano. And so Truman, as you know, is an avid piano player, and his love of music will be dedicated there. What's not installed in this space yet is an exhibit that relates to the letters that Harry Truman wrote to Bess Wallace Truman. And so that's going to be the centerpiece in this room, is the communication, the letters between Harry and Bess in that time period. So this first gallery really deals with Truman's life from when he's born in 1884 up until 1917, when world events take over. And of course, that is World War I. And so when the United States enters World War I under Woodrow Wilson, Truman signs up. Truman actually volunteers for World War I, and we have an interactive that shows his role in the field artillery, firing the guns across enemy lines. And the exhibits surrounding this interactive talk about his training in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and then in New York, and then ultimately arriving in France. And there's some exhibits around that. On the left, we see them celebrating on Armistice Day. On the right, you see Harry Truman in uniform on horseback. And of course, Truman, working on the farm, had learned to ride on horseback many years before. And then in this area, there's actually a multimedia gallery, which in front of it, you can see these World War I artillery pieces. And on the white screen behind will be a video, about a 7-minute video that talks about Truman's experiences in World War I, which is really when he gets his first or second, if you think at the farm, his second experience with leading men. He took over the family farm in 1914 after his father died, and here he is in 1917 and 1918 in France, and he's captain of Battery D and involved in combat on the front in France by 1918. And so this whole video talks about that and the experiences he has leading Battery D and how that affects him for the rest of his life. Now, I am going through this fairly quickly because we have a lot to show you, but that whole gallery, and outside of that gallery, we have Harry Truman's uniforms, military equipment, compasses, and different things he used to measure the trajectory of the shells when they were fired, and all of these things to really tell the story of his World War I experience in depth. As he comes home from France in 1919, the first thing he does is he gets married. And so the next part of the gallery deals more with his relationship with Bess Wallace Truman. They'd really started dating around 1910 and then got engaged really before he went to France. And then coming back in June of 1919, they get married in Independence, and we have the wedding photograph there. And on display will be some of Bess's items, such as her shoes from the wedding. The empty case that you see on the right of that image will be materials related to Margaret Truman, their daughter, who was born 5 years later in 1924. And so there'll be a whole exhibit case devoted to her and some of her childhood items and so forth. The other thing that Truman did when he came back from World War I, and there's some of the letters going back and forth between them. It's an interesting thing, actually. The 1920s and 1930s are when we have the most letters from Bess Wallace Truman. And so we feature those in this part of the exhibit. So prior to this time period and post this time period, we really don't have letters from Bess, just from Harry. So they're featured pretty heavily here. The other piece there in that time period, 1919, 1920, is Truman opens his own business with his Army friend, Eddie Jacobson. And this whole exhibit wall will be devoted to the Truman Jacobson haberdashery, the men's clothing store. And if you look very carefully, the glare of the lights there is a little distracting, but that's Harry Truman at the front of that photograph with all of the ties hanging above him. So we're excited to be able to bring information about the Truman Jacobson store in that part of the gallery. That doesn't last long. It eventually goes bust, and Truman moves into politics with the help, of course, of the Pendergast family. And as he goes into county politics, he's known as a county judge. Really today, we would call that a county commissioner. And this whole next section in the early 20s deals with Truman as a county politician, but also dealing with his relationship with the Pendergast family, who he'd actually been introduced to during World War I. One of Tom Pendergast's nephews was served alongside Harry Truman in World War I, and it was his nephew that recommended him to the bosses and got him into politics after his store had gone bankrupt. So for the most of the 20s, he's involved in Jackson County politics as a county judge or county commissioner before he transitions to the U.S. Senate. I've got a couple of close-ups there about the Pendergast machine. There's an interactive that when I was in there was on the floor, but it's ready to be installed. And this is where Judge Truman is kind of thinking about all of these trials and tribulations of dealing with the Pendergast family and what compromises he has to make with his ethics and so on. So that's going to be a fun interactive that'll be on display. And then this is some of the accomplishments he makes as a county judge or county commissioner. And this is showing the road building that takes place in Jackson County, Missouri, which Truman was instrumental in pushing through in that position. And then eventually we get to the 1930s and we start to talk about Harry Truman as the senator from Missouri. And you might be able to just see on the right side of that caption, his nickname was the senator from Pendergast. He had to kind of shake off that Pendergast connection the times that he was senator. Now he's senator for 10 years before he becomes vice president. So this whole display on this side of the room talks about his accomplishments as the U.S. Senator from Missouri, the tough re-election, and then ultimately probably the thing that he's most known for is his serving on the Truman Committee, which looks at spending in World War II, and he saves the country billions of dollars through his work chairing up the Truman Committee. And there you can see a closer up of that with some photographs and political cartoons and things like that connected to that time period. On the opposite side of that same wall Of course, World War II was started in Europe in 1939 while Truman is a senator. And we have a timeline that shows the progression of World War II, but also at the same time, the progression of Truman in his political career. So you can kind of see side by side what's happening in the world and what's happening with Senator Truman and ultimately Vice President Truman after the 1944 election, which you see on the right side of that timeline. So ultimately we get to April 12th, 1945, and Franklin Roosevelt has died. There's a section on the vice presidency I skipped over. It's not been installed yet. Believe me, it's there. So after FDR dies on April 12th, Truman becomes president. And he really faces a tumultuous first 4 months. And what we have here is next to that title panel you just saw, illuminated are those first 4 months that Truman faces. So he becomes president in April, and then we see what happens in May, what happens in June, what happens in July, and ultimately the dropping of the atomic bomb in August. It's really an incredible first 100, 110 days to look at. And you can see we've got those all lit up in this hallway. And then there's exhibits and a timeline on the wall as you walk through. And I've got a couple of close-ups there. There's the close-up of May and June, and you might be able to make out some of the items from April that lead up to that. And then this is a close-up of June. I chose one that was a little further along in exhibit installation. So in May, we have Germany surrendering. In June, we have the creation of the United Nations in San Francisco. In July, we have the Potsdam Conference where Truman goes to Berlin. And we also have the first successful test of the atomic bomb. And then in August, the decision to drop the atomic bomb. So really a momentous summer for Harry Truman and for the world. And that's how this exhibit deals with that, kind of spells out those important points on the timeline, supplemented by documents and artifacts as you walk through this space. Ultimately, you get to the end of that hallway, which is where we deal with the droppings of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's not been installed yet, but in that space, we will have the safety plug that was used on the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. That will be in a cylindrical tube in the middle of this room. And at the back of that room, we'll have a paper crane created by Sadako, hoping for peace. She was the survivor from the Hiroshima bombings. And then as we come out of there, we can see the casualty figures from World War II, even some of them projected onto the ceiling because there's so many. And then you can kind of see a slightly different angle there of the different casualties suffered by various countries around the globe. And then what faces Truman then after the Japanese surrender in September of 1945 is an opportunity for you to share your thoughts about that time period and about Truman's decision to use atomic weapons to end the war. And then to think about all of the troubles that Truman faced around the world once the war was over. And we've done this with a globe. It's a 14-foot high globe in the next gallery. This is in a rudimentary state. I'll show you some more advanced photos in a moment. And the idea is that you will look at all of the problems around the globe that faces President Truman once the war is over. We're going to do that with videos inside the globe. And there's kind of, you can see 3 of the touchscreen monitors inside the globe there. And then on the outside, we're also going to have video projections on the outside. These will be silent videos, mostly newsreel from all over the world from the 1945 to 1950 time period, showing problems in Asia, in South America, in North America, in Europe, all around the world. There'll be 3 projections on the globe that people can walk around. And you might even be able to tell the cracks in the globe actually are illuminated, and those colors will change as well. There's a better view of one of the projections, and then there'll be subtitles on the bottom showing what the particular news footage is about and which part of the globe. So that's going to be a fascinating way to look at all of the problems Truman faced as he comes out of World War II, as the United States at that point is the most powerful country in the world. Surrounding that globe will be all of the solutions that Truman attempts while president. So things like the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO, the United Nations, the Berlin blockade, and on and on and on. It's amazing when you think about all of the things that he had to try and solve once World War II was over. We have another video gallery in that space, what internally the staff call the Rubble Theater. So you have all of this rubble piled in the corner. Those boxes won't be there, but all of this rubble in the corner in this video projection space. And you can see all the rubble there, a little closer up, the bricks and so on. All of these are props, of course. And then ultimately, I'm showing you a couple, you can probably make out the shape of Europe in the rubble there. There'll be a video projection onto that rubble, looking at how the Cold War begins. So you can see Harry Truman and Joseph Stalin in that part of the video. That's actually from the Potsdam Conference. I recognize the white chairs on the left there. And then you can see Harry Truman in the frame there in these broken down buildings. So a very immersive gallery that goes through how the Cold War began and Truman's role, Stalin's role, Winston Churchill, and so on. How the world is confronted with a new type of war in this, projected on these various pieces of rubble and so forth. And of course, some of those solutions and some of those crises involved in the Cold War, probably the most well-known for Truman is the Berlin Airlift and the rescue of 2 million Berliners once Stalin had blockaded Berlin. So we have kind of the interior fuselage recreated in that space. This is an older photograph here and here, and then a newer photograph from last week where they're illuminating the inside of those panels so you can see various statistics about the Berlin Airlift and some videos and so forth. And then there's a different view there where you can kind of see into the interior of the plane. And then an interactive screen where you can explore further the decisions made about the Berlin Airlift and United States' role in rescuing West Berlin at that time. We move on into the other part of 1948, which is the recognition of Israel. This gallery is probably a little further behind in development, but there is a video in there about Truman being the first world leader to recognize Israel in May of 1948. And these exhibit panels are actually on the floor. They haven't been mounted on the wall yet, but I thought you'd like to see them. I just took this photograph last Tuesday, and it deals with some of the background of the situation in Israel with the Holocaust and displaced persons and the role of the United Nations and the mandate and so on. And in this area too, we have these books that you can look at original documents, and people are disagreeing about whether Truman should do this or not. So on the left, you can see that it says the Jewish people have absolutely no moral or legal right to this land. And on the right side, we absolutely approve of your new plan and do away with the partition and so on and so on. So these books are a really good way to reflect all of the different opinions, and they're all from the time period. This first one was written in March of 48, and the second one in April of 1948. So this is actually before he makes his decision. All of the different information he's been bombarded with in this really nice format for visitors to look at. The next issue that deals with 1948 is Truman's decision to integrate the military, which he does through Executive Order 9981, integrates the military. People are very surprised to hear in the background that troops, the American troops in World War II, were segregated. They're fighting against the Nazis using segregated troops. So when those troops come home from Germany and from Asia, there's really a push to integrate the armed forces. Truman does that through that executive order in the summer of 1948. There's also his President's Committee on Civil Rights puts forward their book of their report to secure these rights in 1947. making recommendations. And parts of that book are also reproduced for visitors to look at. And of course, the other event of 1948 is the famous presidential election. And the white screen there will show a multimedia video of the 1948 election. And you can see the famous Dewey defeats Truman photograph off to the left. And there'll be lots of exhibits and paraphernalia there relating to the 1948 election. Then we move into the second term and Truman's Fair Deal program and his attempts to change things domestically with minimum wage and farm aid and civil rights and labor relations and social security and antitrust laws and on and on and on. One of the biggest domestic proposals ever attempted by a president. Many of those things were not passed, but this exhibit looks at what happened to them and then what happened to them in the future. Some of them were passed later by the likes of Lyndon Johnson and others. And so we can see what happened to some of those issues that Truman proposed in 1949. The other part, of course, that takes over in Truman's second term from 1949 onwards is what we call the Red Scare. China becomes a communist country in 1949. We have loyalty oath hearings, and this table with these computer monitors is a loyalty oath game that I think I might have another photograph of here in a second. We'll get there. And then the other pieces here is the Korean War. All of these are dealt with in this second term of this gallery. There's some Truman Library staff folks trying this Are You a Loyal American game. Takes about 6 minutes to go through and find out whether you're fired or not as you face up to a loyalty oath board. So a really highly interactive experience for visitors there. And then, as I mentioned, the second part there deals with the Korean War. And so there's a 6-screen video on the Korean War that starts in 1950. And you can see it from further back there, a much better photo. And then following that, then exhibitry related to the Korean War from June of 1950 through to January of 1953 when Truman leaves office. And it goes a little further in that and talks about the armistice under President Eisenhower. It also reflects on Truman's meeting with MacArthur in Wake Island and the firing of MacArthur as well. And it does that month by looking at the map of Korea and how the troops move back and forth throughout the conflict. And you can see the part about Wake Island, the meeting with MacArthur there, and then the Chinese entering the war, and so on. This is an empty exhibit case, so not too exciting, but actually we're going to have 5 uniforms displayed in here. The last thing that will go in this museum exhibit, of course, are the original artifacts. We have to make sure that the whole area is dust-free and all the construction is finished before we put the original artifacts in place. So there'll be medical equipment, uniforms, photographs, and other artifacts belonging to individual members of the troops in the Korean War will be displayed in this case. Many of those for the very first time that have not been displayed before at the Truman Library. The next part, as we come out of that, there'll be showing you a hole in the wall. It's very exciting. You can see a corner of the Benton mural there. Those are familiar with our museum. That will stay in place. And this gallery will be devoted thematically to the Trumans in independence. And then where our old gift shop used to be will be the Trumans in Washington, D.C. Of course, they lived in Washington, D.C. for almost 18 years, 10 years as senator and 7.5 years as president. So these 2 areas are thematically the Trumans in independence as a family and the Trumans in Washington, D.C. as a family. A large portion of this space will be devoted to the renovation of the White House that took place while Truman was president. Truman was not living in the White House for about 3 years. He was living in Blair House, which was in the news recently because the night before President Biden's inauguration on January the 19th, he stayed at the Blair House in anticipation to moving in the White House the next day, which is pretty traditional for incoming presidents to stay at the Blair House. Well, Truman lived there for about 3 years while the White House was being renovated. And we have a whole exhibit display on that. This is a fireplace that was taken out of the White House during that renovation. This is the original and will be displayed, as you can see. This is already in place. And then on the left of this photo, hanging from the ceiling, are White House beams, wooden beams that were taken out of the White House during that renovation. Many of the wooden beams were taken out and replaced by steel. And so this is original from the White House that the Truman Library has and will be hanging from the ceiling, or has already done so. Some of these larger items are already in place in the new exhibits. And then you can see some of the family photographs of the Truman family and the Wallace family there around the White House. And then here's a closer up of that beam hanging from the ceiling. And then there's an interactive that we're going to have there where you can kind of break apart the White House on the screen, a touchscreen monitor, to explore all of the different elements of the White House renovation. And this is a good view of that, where you can see all of these different photographs that were taken during the renovation itself. So you can explore all of the different rooms and all of the different floors as the whole White House went under renovation. And there you can see it in action. It's right below the beam, so it's in an appropriate place within the museum. And then our Oval Office that we've had on display, it hasn't gone anywhere, but it is getting a touch of paint and a redo. So we took all of the artifacts out, and they're still not in place. I was in there Tuesday, and the Oval Office remains empty, but they will be reinstalling all of those items once we get to the end of the exhibit. Incidentally, President Biden's Oval Office now has a bust of Harry Truman in his office, which is exciting. And we'll be putting this Oval Office back to represent 1950. We have incredible photographs from 1950 of Truman's Oval Office, and that's what our exhibit is based on. So you can see how it is empty. It's unusual to see it empty. I've worked at the Truman Library 24 years, and it wasn't until 2020 that I saw this reproduction Oval Office empty like this. So that will all be filled up again once we get closer to reopening. Outside of that area, we're dealing with the three branches of government. So here's the legislative branch as we look at civics education and how a bill becomes a law. And we actually use Taft-Hartley Act as the example here, because Truman's veto is actually overridden by Congress in that case. And there's a close-up of that. And then we also look at the Supreme Court and the judicial branch and how Truman is overturned by the Supreme Court in the steel crisis in 1952. So we kind of tried to look at how these presidential powers that Truman had, how they are limited, how they are balanced by the judicial and the legislative branch. And then we look at the executive branch through the various jobs that Truman said he had, like commander-in-chief, chief executive, head of state, and so on, just by looking at one day in his calendar. And then there's all of Truman's cabinet members. That's not the best photograph, I apologize, but that's a list of all of his cabinet members. What's interesting to me, this can win you a few trivia competitions. In Truman's first term in 1945, when he takes over from FDR, it's not until January of 1949, after the 48 election, that he has a vice president. He actually doesn't have a vice president for those 3.5 years that he's president in that first term after he succeeds FDR. And then as we leave the galleries and come towards the end of the exhibit, what we call our legacy space, we look at a variety of issues that Truman has faced and kind of what we can learn from them. And this is a better view. So you can see information about the railroad strikes, Taft-Hartley Act, the steel crisis, Social Security, and so on, civil rights and others. And there's exhibits that will actually go in above and below this timeline, looking at what happened before, but indeed what happened afterwards too. We also, on the other side of that same hallway, have some more prominent figures of the 20th and 21st century and what they have to say about Harry Truman. So Colin Powell, President Clinton, President Obama, President Bush, Kofi Annan, Madeleine Albright, and many, many others that are featured there in kind of a legacy area where people talk about what they owe, how they would like to thank Harry Truman, and how they'd like to remember him. And then as we come towards the end of the exhibit, you can see out into our courtyard, or if you didn't know, President Truman and Mrs. Truman are buried in that courtyard, and you can see out from there. And actually, as you go further down the hallway, you can step out into the courtyard to see the grave sites. But this is a good vantage point from this window. And then on the right side, to finish up, this was a cartoon that was developed after Truman died on December the 26th, 1972. And you see these steps that the cartoon figure of Harry Truman is climbing up: atomic development, United Nations founding, Marshall Plan, NATO, and so on. Then we come back down that hallway where you see very different, hard to see, but down in the corner you see Truman as a farmer, Truman as a soldier, Truman as a businessman, Truman as a senator, and Truman as the president. And then finally, you can't quite see it, but Truman with his grandchildren. So it was finished off as a grandfather, as he's got his grandchildren there. And then back into the main entrance and this stone wall with this wonderful quote from Harry Truman. Mrs. Truman, I hope and believe we've contributed to the welfare of this nation and to the peace of the world, which is a great way to wrap up this exhibit and also my presentation. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing in a moment. There's my email address in case you have questions. I encourage you to look at trumanlibrary.gov. We've got thousands of materials online you can use to learn more about Harry Truman, and in fact, this museum renovation project as well. So with that, I am going to stop my screen.
So Mark, come on back. Are you able to read the chats? I mean, the Q&As? And then I can tackle some of the ones that have their hands raised. And
yes, I can. So let me see. What were his responsibilities as judge? There's two questions. So let me answer the first one. I'm going to move the box out of my way. It was right in front of my own face. The responsibility as a judge. So we think of it like a county commission. So Jackson County, Missouri, they called it a county judge, but it wasn't a legal position. It was more of a county commissioner. So it dealt with Jackson County, which the two largest cities in Jackson County are Kansas City, Missouri, and Independence, Missouri. And of course, Truman grew up in Independence, went to school in Independence. So a lot of it was to do with the usual things that a county would be involved with. Truman's most well known for two things in that role. One was the building of roads. He'd noticed as a farmer and working with his father that the roads in Jackson County were awful. And he went through a huge project of paving roads at that time, one of the biggest road building projects at the time. And the other was to build some new county courthouses in both Kansas City and in Independence. The artillery equipment was the French 75. Yes, that's correct. And that's what we have at the library. So you got that. Don't need me to answer it. Is the ceiling going to, so I can see the next question from Barbara. Do you want me to just carry on, Terry? Is the ceiling going to be painted black? You know, I need to check that. Somebody asked me that last week too, whether we're putting in false ceilings or leaving it black. I think it's probably going to stay that way. It's easier to access the lights and change the light levels. And when you're in the space, you really don't notice it. How far is the museum from Kansas City? It's actually really close. It's about a 15-minute drive from downtown Kansas City, and it's right off the highway. So definitely come and visit and ask for me, and I'll come say hi. Let's see, I'm seeing if there's a question.
So we also
go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say we have a few people that are using the chat instead. And so,
I'll get to those too. Should I go through the Q&A first and then jump over to the chat?
I was just gonna throw in one that says, what happened to the old display items during the renovation? And I wanted to ask you, Mark, do you have any pictures available, or can they see on the website, like the Oval Office when it was all together? Can they?
I might be able to try and find one here in a second.
I mean, if not, it was on I think it was on the website.
It could have been. It could have been.
But I know I've seen it.
Yeah.
And then during the renovation, what did they do with the items?
So all of the items go into storage in our basement. during the renovation, they've gone into storage. So it's really not too difficult. We have them all in storage and kept away.
And someone asked, what did he do and where did he live after his presidency?
He lived in his mother-in-law's home in Independence. He didn't actually own his own home until after the presidency, if you can believe that. Bess Wallace lived with her mother, and when Truman got married in 1919, he moved in. So he lived in his mother-in-law's home. He eventually owned it later. I found a photograph actually online that I'm going to try and share with you. Let me go back. It's a little small, but you get the idea of what this looks like.
It'll look the same, right?
It will look the same once we're done, but there's a kind of a close-up.
Yeah.
It's giving me all these bubbles and things, which is terrible. But you have a sense of what it looks like.
Yeah.
The green drapes rather than the yellow ones you see now. He did not use the Resolute desk, which many presidents did. So I'm going to stop the sharing there. So it will come through. That's a great question about the funding. The funding from the renovation is all privately fundraised. We have a not-for-profit group called the Truman Library Institute, and they have privately fundraised more than $30 million for the project. So no federal money in this particular project. Somebody asked about presidential libraries. The earliest presidential library is Herbert Hoover. So all of the presidents from Hoover up to present day have a presidential library through the National Archives, or a federal agency. And it's not the National Park Service, it's the National Archives. There are fees depending, but they vary by each library and museum. They're not all buried there. It depends on each individual president. And the former president himself will determine where the library is located. The rules have changed a little bit since President Nixon. And now the federal government, which means the National Archives, owns all of the materials, the records, the documents. They belong to the federal government. But the president and his family or his foundation are responsible for building a physical building if they so wish. Those are not federally funded. Oftentimes that former president will then turn the building over to the federal government to administer. So it varies a little bit. Truman raised all of the money himself back in 1957, about $2 million, which seems like a snip by today's prices. And then today, there is federal funding for the federal budget covers about 50% of our operating costs, and the rest is privately funded. Did he own a soda pop store? Not that I'm aware of. Now, you might be confused. His first job was in a pharmacy. He worked in a Clinton drugstore, and today that is a soda pop store and sells ice cream, which I would recommend. But that's the store that used to be the drugstore when he was 14. That was his first job. My contact information, it's my first and last name, mark.adams@nara.gov. He wasn't personally affected by the pandemic, but his family was, although I'm unaware of anybody that died, but I know that Bess, for example, and others did get the flu at that time. We've got letters that he wrote in World War I that reference that. There wasn't a succession plan at that time for him to have a vice president, so we didn't get one until the 1948 election. I don't right at hand have photographs of the original entrance. Sorry, go ahead, Terry.
I'm sorry, I just was going to say, did you say the one about his responsibilities as a judge? Did you answer that one?
I did say that about the county commissioner. Yeah, the road building
unit equipped. Okay, with the
I did. I think I did get through that one.
Okay, great.
Yeah, you mentioned Rutherby Hayes. Those libraries prior to Herbert Hoover are usually privately run. Those from Herbert Hoover forward, so I'm not going to test you out, but Hoover, FDR, Truman, etc., those are all part of the National Archives, including the Nixon Library, which was done through a court case. That's a whole other presentation. So I think I got those. Let me go back to the chat.
Can I allow Kathy? She has a question to talk, to ask a
Please
question.
do. Please
Kathy?
do.
You can unmute.
I already asked a couple of questions that he answered. Who was his vice president when they did get the vice president?
Alban Barkley. Alban Barkley. He was a senator.
The famous one.
And then, of course, somebody asked about the background to recognition of Israel in 1948. It's a pretty complicated topic, but Truman's advisors, such as Clark Clifford and others, felt like that after the Holocaust, they should support that Zionist effort. It was very controversial. His own cabinet member, probably one of his most famous cabinet members, disagreed with him on the issue, and that was George Marshall. And so, very controversial issue, but mainly because of his biblical upbringing, the treatment of the Jews during World War II, felt like that he wanted to help the Jewish cause. Eddie Jacobson, who he met in World War I and opened the business with, was Jewish, and he encouraged Truman to meet Chaim Weizmann, who was the Zionist leader at the time, that really encouraged Truman to recognize Israel as soon as possible. The piece about the soda plant, very good information there about Polly's Pop. Thank you for that.
Linda with Linda S., do you have a question? You can unmute. Linda S. Okay, I think
I do not, but it was very interesting.
Thank you.
I'm still, give me 10, 15 minutes and then I'll maybe come up with it.
That's okay.
I think you guys can all see the chat, right? So I'm going to type my email address in the chat.
Yes.
And that way you have it. So that'll be helpful, because the NARA part, the NARA, is people get confused with that, thinking I'm saying an M. I'm originally from England, so that English accent slips in once in a while.
And yet, what did you say, 24 years at the Truman?
24 years today, actually.
Oh, congratulations.
February the 2nd, 1997. We all remember the 1990s, right? Well, my first day on the job, a lot less gray hair and no beard. February the 2nd, 1997 was my first day at the Truman Library.
Groundhog Day, fabulous.
Yeah, 24 years of Groundhog Day.
All right, are there any other questions that we haven't answered in the chat?
I think I see one about the Pendergasts in the chat. Tom Pendergast, it was kind of the Kansas City machine politics and the mob. So very strong role in Kansas City politics. And really, you couldn't get elected without the support of Pendergast. And Truman was connected with them as a county commissioner and somewhat as a U.S. senator as well. So that's kind of one of those things that people look at closely to see whether it really influenced any of the decisions he really made. So there's some interesting books about Pendergast and Truman that you might want to Google and find those, because those are kind of fascinating. So yeah, very familiar name in Kansas City politics.
All right, so let's see, where are we? Virginia, did you have a question? Virginia? Nope, okay. This is why the webinar is so weird to me. I'm so used to just seeing people, with their questions. Go ahead.
Were there many repercussions after he integrated the armed forces?
It was interesting. The different branches of the military reacted to it differently. The Army was the slowest to integrate compared to the other branches of the military. And but the Korean War, which started in 1950, really accelerated that integration because they were on the ground in combat. And so after that, it really, the issue sort of frittered away, because by then they were well integrated.
Okay, Nancy, did you have a question? Nancy G? takes a minute for them to unmute.
I see a question about Eisenhower. I can take that one.
Sure, go for it.
So they asked about his relationship with Eisenhower. Originally, it was quite friendly, but then as time went on, it got less so. Truman actually offered the presidency to Eisenhower prior to the 1948 election. Eisenhower turned him down. When Eisenhower came out as a Republican and an opponent, then Truman and Eisenhower's relationship soured. However, they did do a very peaceful transition in 1953 after Eisenhower defeated Stevenson. And I think if I scroll down, there might be another one.
Yeah, someone asked the best book to read. I'm so sorry. The best book to read about Truman.
So there's a couple I would recommend. Some are a little bit older and some are newer. I know many of you are probably familiar with David McCullough's Truman biography. That is excellent. I'd also recommend Robert Farrell's Truman, A Life. And then more recently, the author A.J. Bain has put out 2 books on Truman. One is called The Accidental President, and that deals with Truman's first 100 days. So it's a narrower time frame, but a great read. And then he's also just recently put a book out about the 1948 election, which is also fascinating. Somebody asked about the ceiling beams from the original White House. Yes, they were. They were taken out of the White House and given to President Truman. Was he eligible? Someone is also asking if he was eligible to run again in 1952. He was. They didn't change that until the next term. So he would have been able to run in 1952. But the Korean War had left his popularity very, very low. And so he said he wasn't going to run. And he backed Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic candidate.
You see the question about if something had happened to Truman between 45 and 48, who would have become president?
I think that I'm going to get this wrong. I think that would have been the Speaker of the House, but they've changed that succession plan, so I'd have to go back and look at that.
Yeah, I would have guessed that, but you know more
so
than I do.
I may have to look that one up for you. Right off the top of my head, I would say the Speaker, but I know as soon as I say it, I might have that wrong.
It's
because of that situation, and the idea that Truman and the fact that FDR had gone into his 4th term, some of those things led to some amendments after that in terms of the succession plan, but also how many terms a president can run. So some of those changed during the Eisenhower administration, and I just don't quite have that detail. I will type the authors' names.
Yeah, I was about to do that. Thank you, because I couldn't remember.
A.J. Bain.
Someone asked.
Typing live, hoping you won't spell things wrong. I just put the 3 authors. I think if you put those 3 authors' names and the word Truman, then you'll be fine. Henry Wallace was the VP before Truman.
Forgive me if I'm repeating because I'm so busy doing things I don't catch everything. But someone asked about his relationship with Eisenhower. Did you address that?
I did, yeah. It got worse and worse. But they did. It's important to say, though, it is important to say that they did have a peaceful transition. And they're photographed together at Eisenhower's inauguration and so forth. Just curious, do you know who did the indoor design exhibits? You mean for our new, I think you mean for our new museum renovation? Is that what you mean? Harvey, if you could just follow up. If you mean for the, for our new exhibits. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so there's a team of, so the design of the new exhibits was done by Gallagher and Associates. They have offices on the East and West Coast. This group came out of Portland. The installation is being done by 1220 out of Nashville, Tennessee. The multimedia is done by Monadnock Media. And I believe, I'm going to get this wrong, I think Connecticut, but I might have that wrong. And then the general construction is J.E. Dunn in Kansas City. And you know Gallagher, so there you go. So Gallagher was the exhibit designer, yes.
I have to say, this is the first time I've seen a museum in that kind of, construction stage or reconstruction stage.
It's this way. Yeah.
It's very interesting. It's really fun. It makes me want to work in one, but I always have.
And I promise we can do this again when we have a physical building and I can take a camera through.
Absolutely. We would love to do that. And also, just for everyone that knows, Mark, as you can see, he's been around for 24 years. He has a lot of expertise on the subject of Harry Truman and his presidency and his life. And we would love to have you back for a specific program.
Oh, so, no problem. Anytime.
Yeah. All right. Do you see any last questions or any in the chat or anything else? Because we are coming up on 3 o'clock my time. So I think someone told me he made no money from being president.
I don't see any more, but I apologize. My email address is there. So if I missed your question, feel free to email.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of thank yous. And
you're welcome, everybody.
In the chat. And of course, during a real Zoom meeting, we would let everybody unmute. They all say thank you. And from all over the country, we have them. So we had about 250 folks on today.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, they were so quiet, weren't they? So thank you, Mark, again. You're getting, like I said, you're getting a lot of thank yous from everywhere.
Thank you, everybody. Please visit trumanlibrary.gov. We have a wonderful amount of material on the 50,000 photographs and hundreds of documents, and really fascinating. And encourage you to go to trumanlibrary.gov and explore and see all of the things that we have available for everybody.
Tell me again when you think you may be open.
We're hoping May, but please don't quote me on that. Okay. So it's like a lot of these things, it's dependent on the pandemic. And as we're a federal building, our regulations are a little tighter, and we have to get authorization from Washington, D.C. to reopen. I will tell you right now, there are no federal staff in the building. We're not allowed any federal staff in the building at all. So we're about as close as we can be. Now, our contractors who are building and installing the exhibits are the 7 of them on site today working on installing the exhibits. But we can't open without federal staff to open the doors. So we're really hoping by Truman's birthday on May 8th, we'll be able to have a glass of champagne and celebrate.
That would be wonderful. I hope you all take lots of pictures and come live over Facebook or something when you do it.
Absolutely.
That would be great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's been really fun too, just to see the creativity that goes into the exhibits. It's been a great team. Yeah, we've had probably more staff involvement in this renovation planning than any other exhibit that I've been involved with in my 24 years there. So it's really from the heart of the staff as well as the designers. Well, it's really, really fun to see that today, Mark. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. I'm going to sign out, but please email me if you have questions, okay?
All right. We're going to say goodbye.
Everyone. Okay,
bye, everyone.